A desperate dash across a border. A quiet walk up to an airport agent. A cold, dangerous crossing over open water. However they got here, they're all heading for the same place. A small town in the rural northeast of the Netherlands called Ter Apel. For a refugee, it's supposed to be the promised land. But it isn't what it looks like in the brochure. The place that's supposed to mean safety and certainty is now buried in controversy, politics, and competing agendas. Protests and counter-protests have become almost routine every time the numbers spike. Locals in a town of just 10,000 people raise real concerns about services and safety. And activists on the other side warn about rising intolerance and self-appointed patrol groups. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Ter Apel went from the Netherlands' flagship refugee center to a national tragedy. And what happens when border politics, social media, and migration all collide in one muddy field. First, the basics. Held right against the German border sits this small Dutch town. This is about as off the beaten path as the Netherlands gets. No tulip fields, no postcard canals. There are a few ways refugees get here. Some pay smugglers, often at a steep and dangerous price, while others make their own way to the Netherlands, walk up to a government building, and formally ask for asylum. So you, the new arrival, end up in the rural north, at a facility that can hold around 2,000 people. It's basically its own village, its own services, its own clinic, and even its own school. For most refugees, this is their very first contact with Dutch life. And who comes here? It's people at the end of their options, like Syrians who fled Damascus after the fall of the Assad regime, or Eritreans and Somalis escaping conflict at home, and Ukrainians trying to reach safety, and more recently, even some Americans taking preemptive measures against policies they fear after Donald Trump returned to the White House in 2025. But here's the problem. Ter Apel is supposed to be a safe haven, but human rights monitors keep publishing photos of suffocating overcrowding. As recently as May 2026, the Red Cross and Dutch media reported that Ter Apel had blown past its maximum, with around 2,300 people crammed inside, the highest in years. This isn't the first time. Back in 2022, a surge of arrivals pushed the center past breaking point, with deadly consequences. So why are people sounding the alarm again? In May, the Dutch Red Cross issued a blunt warning. If the government doesn't step in immediately, Ter Apel will run out of room for women and children and start turning people away at the door. And there's a reason they specified women and children. In 2026, Ter Apel began turning away single men. The director of the Dutch Red Cross, Harm Goossens, put it plainly. It's the government's duty to offer people a place. Yet again, people are standing out in the grass with no idea what comes next. So where do the single men go? Camp beds, in emergency shelters in Groningen. When a spot opens at Ter Apel, they get sent back, round and round. And overcrowding isn't just a comfort issue, it's a health one. As one Red Cross press officer told DW, people are getting blisters, foot problems, and skin infections because they can't shower and have been sleeping rough outside. Step back for a second. The Netherlands isn't actually one of Europe's big refuge countries. That's Germany, host to roughly 2.7 million Ukrainian, Syrian, and Afghan refugees. The Netherlands does meet its obligations under the Geneva Convention and EU rules, but it runs a tightly managed system, and lately it's tilted towards stricter controls, higher rejection rates, and loud political pushback. In 2025, rejections outnumbered approvals. The Netherlands isn't an outlier in Europe, but the shift has been sharp, and Ter Apel is where you can see it. When it comes to Ter Apel, there are really two kinds of presence, the police and a policing presence. They are not the same thing. Historically, this was rough. According to emeritus criminal law professor Anton von Kalmthout, the squads escorting people once had no training and no debriefing, no medical care en route, and, he says, they would give people injections to keep them calm. A complaints committee and more humane oversight came later. But as recently as 2024, border police used force against children at least 10 separate times. We know this because the Argos radio program reported that during forced deportations, the Royal Marechaussee used force and physical restraints at least 199 times in 1 year, drawing condemnation from the children's rights group Defense for Children, which described evidence of unnecessary, excessive violence against minors. Official authorities aren't out harassing people. That part has been taken up by civilians. In June 2024, a 54-year-old man named Jan Huizen from the nearby village of New Vierding created a WhatsApp group to rally people against migration activity near Ter Apel. They set up near the border between Ter Apel and Sellingen, stopped cars, and went looking for what they decided were suspicious vehicles. What set him off? Huizen said he'd seen a Facebook post claiming German police were dropping asylum seekers across the Dutch border, by van and even helicopter. His call to action pulled in double the people he expected. 20 showed up. And what did they find? In Huizen's own words to NRC, they didn't find any asylum seekers, adding, in language that revealed exactly who they were looking for, that they hadn't found any black people or anything resembling them. If they had, he said, they'd have chased and questioned them and filmed it to create what he called a scandal. He even gave the police an ultimatum: increase official border patrols or 20 times as many civilians would show up to do it themselves. That was the last straw. On June 20th, Huizen was arrested. The official line was firm. Border control is the job of the Royal Marechaussee, not private citizens. There is no room for vigilantism. But plenty of civilians cheered it on, and in the days after, people drove in from Limburg, Utrecht, and Rotterdam to play border guard. And then there's Geert Wilders, founder of the far-right Party for Freedom, known for his anti-immigration and anti-Islam platform, and by 2025, a 10-point anti-immigration plan. On X, he threaded the needle. He understood the frustration, told people not to take the law into their own hands, and still called the whole thing a fantastic initiative. This didn't appear out of nowhere. In 2025, just before the general election, right-wing activist Els Rex drew an estimated 1,500 people into the streets in Dutch flags and banners, and it turned into a riot. Bottles, stones, fires, including a torched police car. They vandalized the offices of the centrist D66 party. 4 police officers and 7 journalists were hurt. The damage to government buildings topped €89,000. And the condemnation came from every direction. Labor leader Frans Timmermans called the riot Trumpian. The Hague's mayor and D66's leader condemned it. Caretaker Prime Minister Dick Schoof called it shameless and unacceptable. Even Wilders, the country's most famous anti-immigration politician, called the rioters idiots. Zoom out again, because this is bigger than one town. Across Europe, deportations have been ramping up. In a move that migration rights groups compare to Trump-era U.S. policy, the EU has begun setting up controversial detention centers abroad, return hubs. Countries including the Netherlands, Denmark, Greece, Germany, and Austria have been cutting deals, many with African nations, to send migrants back. It echoes 2016. When leaders like Angela Merkel struck a deal with Turkey to take back irregular migrants. Now, why is The Hague always in chaos over this? Because Dutch politics is a patchwork, and on migration, almost nobody agrees. On one side, the center-right VVD, led by Dilan Yeşilgöz, wants refugees admitted only through resettlement programs, and to set that number by capacity, which rights groups note could be set as low as 0. The populist BBB doesn't reject immigration outright, but wants asylum claims processed outside Europe entirely. On the other side, the left alliance, GLP-VDA, wants fast, careful procedures and backs UN resettlement, broadly shared by the socialist SP, which wants procedures capped at 6 months and a crackdown on rights abuses at Europe's borders. D66 wants to expand how many people can come through the UN's UNHCR program. The Party for the Animals rejects the EU Migration Pact, fearing it leads to abuse rather than fair distribution. And at the far end, Wilders' PVV wants to erase the right to seek asylum altogether, meaning the Netherlands would withdraw from international refugee treaties. In July 2025, the PVV introduced a bill to criminalize offering asylum or compassionate help to undocumented migrants, cut asylum residency from 5 years to 3, and halt asylum permits. The Christian Democrats called it unacceptable. The Association of Dutch Municipalities called it legally untenable, warning police would essentially have to break one law to comply with another. So where does all of that land? Right back at Ter Apel. Asylum permits, cut from 5 years to 3. Permanent residence, stopped. Family reunification, tightened. Procedures, faster, which is the good news and the bad news, depending on which side of the desk you're on. In the first quarter of 2026, first-time asylum applications jumped 33% to around 6,000. For comparison, 2025 saw about 24,000, down 25% from 2024 and down from roughly 38,000 in 2023. And in 2025, for the first time in a while, rejections outnumbered acceptances, 8,100 to 7,400. The backlog is staggering, over 50,000 open cases. The top nationalities applying: Syrians, Eritreans, Somalis, Algerians, Afghans, and Iraqis. All of that tension spilled into the streets. On May 9, 2026, far-right and anti-immigration groups gathered outside the center. 2 people were arrested, one for insulting officers, allegedly calling them NSBers, a reference to wartime Nazi collaborators. Another for trying to breach the counter-protest zone. Police even confiscated a flag bearing far-right symbols. At the same time, a registered counter-demonstration, including the group Groningen Against Extreme Right, drew around 200 people, chanting, "Refugees are welcome here." Police had to physically keep the 2 crowds apart. And here's one of the strangest twists of 2026. Americans have started joining the asylum lines at Ter Apel. Though, as Leiden University migration scholar Marlou Schrover points out, their odds are low. According to the Dutch Asylum Ministry, around 20 American asylum seekers were deported back to the U.S. in 2025. It comes down to the UN Refugee Convention's tests. You have to prove you faced persecution, show you tried and failed to get protection from your own authorities, and show there's no safe alternative inside your own country. Behind the numbers are people, and their accounts are what keep this story alive online. A man, DW, called Saleh, fleeing Yemen, described weeks of stress, insomnia, and anger, speaking from a torn mattress outside the center. He said he'd been sleeping outside for more than 3 weeks because Ter Apel was full, that he couldn't even register, and that the endless waiting and uncertainty had left him in a very dark place. Another account, also via DW, Yahia Main, from Sierra Leone, who arrived with his wife and 2 kids. He claimed there were empty rooms inside, while the center said it was full. that they just didn't want to admit more people. He said his family wasn't getting proper food, and that officials wanted to move him to another center and separate him from them to make room for new arrivals. "I didn't expect this from the Netherlands," he said. Then the internet got involved directly. A Dutch YouTuber who goes by Dutch Travel Maniac, nearly 500,000 subscribers, known for extreme travel content, decided to test the claims himself. In January 2026, he dropped what it's really like inside the Netherlands' largest asylum center, and in March, a follow-up, exposing the Dutch asylum seeker system. He interviewed bus drivers, asylum seekers, locals, and guards, and surfaced claims of cover-ups, drug smuggling, harassment, and lax checks. He's open about his angle. He's fed up with mass immigration and believes the whole system is corrupt. So how should we read those videos? Researchers like Ofra Klein, who studies far-right social media at Erasmus University, argue they're anti-immigration videos dressed up as travel content, a form of meta-politics, a selective slice rather than a neutral picture. Other critics say actual Ter Apel residents are being filmed, harassed, and provoked for content, which only adds to the tension on the ground. Is this a humanitarian crisis, an economic one, a political one? D66's Sophia Intfeld argues it's politics, that the overcrowding, the protests, and the riots trace back to government mismanagement, and that the idea of simply having no more asylum seekers is, in her words, an illusion. In the end, Ter Apel isn't really a story about one overcrowded center in a quiet Dutch village. It's a story about what a country decides to value: humanitarian duty, national capacity, local cohesion, or political control, and how long it can hold the tension between all four. Ter Apel is a visible symptom of a much larger, unresolved European question. How do you stay a place of refuge in a world that keeps producing people who desperately need one, without losing the stability that made you a refuge in the first place? That's the story of Ter Apel. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next.